Welcome to the Ayn Rand Fan Club. I'm Scott Schiff along with William Swig. William, how are you today?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. We are very pleased to have Liberty Movement icon Walter Block with us today. He's the Worth Economics Chair at Loyola Business School, former senior fellow at the Mises Institute, which we'll get into, prolific author, including the classic Defending the Undefendable. Walter, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, and thanks for calling me an icon. I'm not sure it's justified, but it has a nice ring to it. Thank you.
Very nice. Well, I just want to get right into things. I saw you do some interviews where you talked about meeting Rand, and I'm just fascinated about, if you could just recap some of your early story and how you found your way to her and even Rothbard.
Absolutely. I was born in Brooklyn, and Brooklyn, I'm Jewish, and Jews in Brooklyn are all a bunch of pinkos, and I was a pinko. I went to school, high school, with Bernie Sanders, and his views and mine were indistinguishable. We were both on the track team together. We both ran the same distances, so we were sort of buddies, and my views were about the same as his. Although he was really into it, I wasn't that much into it, but I supported that. And then Ayn Rand came to Brooklyn College to speak, and I was a student at Brooklyn College, and I came to listen to her. I thought she was all wrong because she favored free enterprise, and free enterprise is fascism. And I sat through her talk and I listened and applauded some things and booed other things. That was before the days of cancellation. We didn't cancel anyone. If you disagreed, a polite boo or hiss, and then you let the person speak. So it was very polite. At the end of the meeting, the Ayn Rand Study Club, or I forget what they called it, the ones that had invited her to Brooklyn College, said that there was a lunch in her honor and anyone could come, even if you disagreed. And I wanted to convert her to socialism. So I came, and there was this long, long table, maybe 50 people on a side. And Ayn Rand was sitting at the head of the table, and Nathaniel Branden on the one side, Alan Greenspan, Leonard Peikoff, and the usual crew. And the
Right.
only empty seats were way at the other end of the table. So I went there and I sat down and I turned to my neighbor and I said, capitalism is evil, socialism is the way to go. I forget if that was my exact words, but something like that. And he said, well, I don't really know all that much about it, but the people who do are at the other end of the table. So I was a chutzpahnik, still am, and I went and I stuck my head between Ayn's and Nathan's, and I said, "There's a socialist here who wants to debate someone on socialism and capitalism." And they said, "Who is it?" And I said, "Me." And I was a student. I was maybe 20 years old. Branden maybe 35. Rand 50. Branden was very, very nice. He said, "Look, there's no room at this end of the table, but I'll come to your end of the table and talk to you under two conditions. One, you don't allow this conversation to lapse until we settle it. If we don't settle it now, we continue." I said, "Okay." And secondly, you'll read two books that I'll recommend. One was Atlas Shrugged, and the other was Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. And I agreed and I complied. And we spoke for an hour and we didn't come to any conclusion. So I went to his house in Manhattan and Ayn Rand's house, and the usual crew were there: Leonard Peikoff, Alan Greenspan, a few others, Barbara Branden. And after 4 or 5 sessions, I was converted.
Wow.
Half of the conversion was the talking, and the other half, or maybe three-quarters, was the books. I couldn't put Atlas Shrugged down. I mean, what was it, 1,100 pages? I read it in one weekend. It was the most magnificent book I've ever read.
I
It
had
is,
that same experience at 19.
Yeah,
it,
me too. I read it in college and read it over the course of maybe a week or two.
I
I
read
was
it.
gonna, what do you think is so special about it in your opinion? Like, why does it stand out in your mind as the best novel?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I mean, it was just inspirational. I never read the Gold Speech. That was just boring. But the rest of it, and every 10 years after that, I've read the book. I've never read the Gold Speech, but every 10 years or so, I read the book again and I get more out of it. I guess the one word description I would have is inspirational. You know, she comes from Russia. English is not her first language, and yet the dialogue, I mean, she's a genius. Uh, she's magnificent. It just blew me away. I was just inspired by it.
I
So,
was taken by the detail of the narrative, or the descriptions, and the level of the dialogue was at such a high level, that you didn't normally see that in novels. I was in college reading pretty crappy novels that were assigned to me by my postmodern professors, and then I read Atlas Shrugged, and there's like a totally different world. It was like reading another Victor Hugo novel or something like that.
well, I wouldn't besmirch her by comparing her with Victor Hugo. I think she's way above him. I guess I'm not as literary as you guys. You maybe thought more about it, and you can be more specific. And all I can say is pathetically inspirational. But I feel yes, the dialogue, the ideas, the concepts, the backstabbing of Dagny Taggart's brother. It just was magnificent. And now I was converted. I was never a Randian. I was never an objectivist because I didn't understand all this epistemology and metaphysics and also I didn't like the idea that Mozart was no good and that Rachmaninoff was great. I never could understand that. I'm a fan of Mozart and Bach, and Rachmaninoff is okay, but we diverge in our tastes on music. But tastes on music are irrelevant to political economy.
It's supposed to be.
Well, for her, they weren't irrelevant. What was it? Mozart had a evil philosophy of life. I mean, I never could understand that. So anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say we did a show where we played a clip of you on Malice talking about how when you were in the original part of the group, the base level, they were nice to you, but when you joined NBI, then it became what you described as more cultish. Can you expand on that a little?
Yeah, this was this must have been 1965, no, maybe 64, 63. I forget. I'm not a historian. And this, I think, was roughly at the beginnings of the NBI, the Nathaniel Branden Institute. And Nathan invited me, and I came, and I liked it. But there was this little bit of cultishness. Like after the speeches during the question period, if you asked Ayn Rand or Branden a question like, well, on page 42, you said this. Could you elaborate on that? And that was a perfectly good question, and she would elaborate on it, and there was no problem. But if you were a little critical and said, well, on page 42, you said this, but on page 371, you said that, and I see a contradiction, she would tell you to get out. I mean, I was horrified.
That happened multiple times?
Oh, often. Whenever there was a hostile question. And yet, during my, how shall I say, introduction, Branden was not like that at all. I mean, when I came at him, capitalism is evil because the poor will be poor or something. He never said, shut up or anything like that. He was very, very good. But on stage, it was more cultish. So I sort of developed a schizophrenic attitude, approach avoidance. I would go to the NBI and I would listen, and then I would be disgusted and I'd leave. But I didn't know any other free enterprisers. So after 3 months, I would come back because I needed another dose of economic freedom and liberty. And so I had this approach, avoidance, reaction to them. And then I was at Columbia University getting my PhD, and this is 65, that I remember. And Larry Moss said, you have to meet this guy, Murray Rothbard. He's an anarchist. I said, anarchist? I don't want to meet any anarchist. Anarchism is evil, because I was still a Randian-ish or an objective-ish person in political economy.
Right.
But then finally, he and his roommate, Jerry Wallows, ganged up on me, and they said, you got to meet Murray Rothbard. You got to meet Murray Rothbard. And I finally went to his house and I met him, and I in about 10 minutes he converted me to anarcho-capitalism. He used Hazlitt against me. He said, "Look, you agree that the post office should be privatized. Why? Because if they do a bad job, they'll go broke. Whereas a government post office, if they do a bad job, they'll stay in, and this is inefficient. Well, why can't we apply this to the police, to armies, to courts, whatever else the government is doing?" And the light bulb went over my head, and I was converted. It took me a little longer to get into Austrian economics because I was under the tutelage of Gary Becker, a Nobel Prize winner in economics, and he was a mainstream economist. And they rejected the idea of a synthetic a priori in economics, namely something that's not a tautology and not an empirical statement, but a necessarily true claim that has something to do with the real world. For example, I noticed William has got a nice hat on, and I posit that he paid $20 for that hat. And I now claim as an Austrian economist that at the time he purchased that hat, he valued the hat more than $20 and he made a profit. And the guy who sold him that hat valued it at $5 and therefore made a $15 profit. And that this is necessarily apodictically true, cannot be denied, cannot be tested, cannot be verified. If you understand the English language, you know the truth that ex ante, he valued that hat more than the money he paid for it. Ex post, maybe he doesn't, but he's still wearing it. So I deduce also that he still values that hat. I couldn't get that through my head. It took me a year or two under Murray Rothbard's tutelage. But finally, I became an anarcho-capitalist libertarian Austrian. And that's pretty much my view after 1965 when I met Murray Rothbard. But I still have great fondness for Ayn Rand and the objectivists. Look, they were the ones who converted me. Without them, I'd still be a Bernie Sanders type, which
Now,
is horrible.
Rothbard had his own split from the inner circle. I think it read it, and it usually begins with Ayn Rand. I'm just curious, were you around for the 68 split with Branden? What were things like then? Any kind of stories or anecdotes of anyone from that time?
Yeah, well, there were two cancellations. It turned out that Ayn Rand had an affair with Nathaniel Branden, and that
Did anyone
Branden,
suspect anything at the time?
no, I wasn't that close to it by 68.
Right.
Uh, I didn't go to the NBI meetings anymore. I sort of hung around more with Murray Rothbard and his living room crowd, Leonard and Ralph Raico and Ron Hammaway and Walter Grinder and people like that. Uh, I had found my niche, my group.
People.
These were my people. So I was no longer schizophrenic with regard to Ayn Rand. And also, she rejected libertarianism. She called us hippies of the right. I never could understand that. And also, my first book came out, Defending the Undefendable, in 1971. And Harry Binswanger wrote a vicious attack on it because I favored the legalization of, I don't know what, pornography or prostitution. And he didn't distinguish. He made the mistake of thinking that I favored those things. No, I didn't favor those things. I only favored the legalization of those things, which is an entirely different concept. So me and the Randians were disparate, but I was a little. I still subscribed to the Ayn Rand or the Objectivist newsletter or whatever, and then I was appalled to find out that Branden was a bum, and why was he a bum? Ayn Rand didn't explain that. Later, it turned out that he had broken up with an affair with her, which is of great interest sociologically, I suppose. So that was one breakup or one cancellation. The other cancellation is they kicked Murray Rothbard out of the Ayn Rand inner circle or the Ayn Rand group. The collective, they called it the collective sort of as a joke. And they accused him of, what was it, plagiarizing Barbara Branden's master's essay. And Murray and his colleagues wrote all sorts of stuff saying, look, this stuff that wasn't original with Barbara Branden, and making that citation. So cancellations have been part of our movement for a long time, which is problematic, I think.
You
It,
mentioned before that when you talked to Rand and Brandon in private, they were very nice and wanted to, you know, have a conversation with you until you reached an agreement. But then, like at NBI, which I assume was a more public setting with everyone being taught, then they would kick you out of the meeting for asking difficult questions. Do you think that could have something to do with Rand's thinking about like integration, where she thought that every word in Atlas Shrugged was correct and she wouldn't take one word out, and so it all fit together. And so if you started challenging her system, she couldn't like handle that in a public setting because maybe it was a bit of an embarrassment if she didn't have an answer.
Well, you're really asking a question that a psychologist would be better
yeah.
off answering than me. I don't know why. All I know is that was the fact that during my conversion process, which took a month or two, and maybe I would come there once a week for a month or two, they were very nice, and I was asking very sharp questions. I was asking hostile questions and making arguments against free enterprise and private property rights and profits and all that. There was not even a hint that if you disagreed with them, they're going to kick you out of the apartment. Nothing like that. And I was very happy to be converted and very grateful to them for converting me. But that was in private, where I once brought my roommate, Ben Klein, who later became a professor of economics at UCLA, and my other roommate, Mel Fine, who became a professor, I forget what it was, of sociology in Georgia. And the three of us came, and they treated us all very nicely in private. Well, private is, 10 people, and it was like a living room. But in public, it was like a totally different person. And I was shocked and horrified because the person who was so open and willing to debate and argue was very different in public. My professor at Brooklyn College was John Hospers and Martin Lean, Lean. And
Yeah.
both of them was sort of my mentors at Brooklyn College. And John Hospers was another person who got kicked out of the Ayn Rand group because at some philosophical meeting on aesthetics, he treated her like he would treat any other colleague. He would say, I think he reviewed something that she wrote, and he said, well, here are 5 things that I agree, and it's really great, but here are 1 or 2 areas where we diverge. And she blew up at him because, I don't know, she's got this thing that in public she acts very differently than in private. Now you're asking why, and I haven't got the slightest notion of why.
Well,
Uh,
you kind of you labeled it like it's cult like, and I kind of agree with that. I think especially in these public settings where sometimes it's private issues that come into the public sphere, or it's just like you asking a difficult question in a public setting, and then they have a different attitude. And the only change in context that I really see here is that one's a more private matter or context, and one's a more public context. And so there's some level of public facing issues going on where they're concerned with how they're going to appear to their devotees or the people around them.
Well, even that I don't think holds water, although I think it's a good shot at this because she's been on TV. And that's as public as you can get. That's even more public than the NBI because more people would watch Johnny Carson or whoever's interviewing her. And there she was much nicer. She didn't walk off the stage in a huff.
Well,
When
when some woman in the Donahue audience asked a particular question, she refused to answer the question because the woman was seen as being rude.
Yeah.
And then she said, "Oh, I'll answer the same question if someone asked it nicely." So I
okay,
think that even
that's a,
on the Donahue show, I think there's some examples of it. But again, the
Well,
Donahue audience wasn't her specific followers.
Let me try this a different way. I've heard people suggest that Nathaniel was somewhat of the hatchet man and egging this on, and maybe even more so as the relationship was deteriorating. Is that fit with what you experienced?
Well, I wasn't as intimate with them as would enable me to answer that question.
Okay, that's fair.
With regard to the hostile question, at the NBI, they weren't impolite. They didn't call her a son of a gun or whatever. So on the Donahue show, I think she was perfectly reasonable in saying, look, I'll answer the substance of that question if you rephrase it or if somebody else asks it in a polite way, but I don't like to interact with impolite people. But the point I'm making is that on the Donahue show or any other TV show, that's pretty public. And she was pretty nice. And I don't count refusing to answer an impolite question as not being nice. I regard that as perfectly reasonable and not at all cultish. And I think that that's a nice model for everyone. That if people, call you a son of a bitch and then ask you a question, you can say, look, I appreciate the substance of your question, but I'm not going to answer it because I don't like to deal with impolite people. So if you'll either rephrase or if somebody else will ask me the same question in a polite way, I'll answer it. That's fine. That's not cultish.
Sure. Do you think that Rothbard and Hosper's involvement with the early Libertarian Party maybe played a role in Rand being so against it?
Yeah, that's another thing. When Hospers ran for president, she didn't support Hospers. I mean, Hospers was, overlap with her 99.9%. Whereas the other people, I forget who Hospers was running against. I think it was in 1972.
Yeah,
Uh,
Nixon and McGovern.
Nixon and McGovern, Nixon might have agreed with her 50% and McGovern 5% and Hospers 99%. And she's supporting Nixon. I mean, what's that? That's sort of an anomaly. You'd think she allowed personalities to get involved in politics, which obviously Hospers is very, very close to objectivism, certainly on economics. Hospice specialty was aesthetics, and they might have had some disagreement about aesthetics. Who knows? Maybe it was about Mozart and Rachmaninoff, for all I know. But look, Ayn Rand was not a perfect person. She had flaws. She was brilliant. She was magnificent, but she had one clay toe, if I can put it in that way. She had problems, but I'm very, very grateful to her. Without her, I don't know where I'd be. She was my mother, my mentor, my guide. It was mainly Nathaniel, but her also, and Nathaniel wouldn't have been in that position that he was if it wasn't for her. So I am very grateful to her. And we have to acknowledge that she had flaws. No big deal. She was a human being, and all human beings are, what are we? The mistake-making animal. That's us.
Yeah, I've said that I think Branden tried to portray her as perfect as he was trying to get away from the relationship.
Yeah, well, she wasn't perfect. None of us are perfect. We all make mistakes. No
Look,
big
I
deal.
think at this stage, I think anyone who likes Rand and learn from her needs to shift into second gear and start thinking for themselves, and that sometimes requires criticizing some of the things she said and
sure.
coming up with your own ideas. I don't think she was right on everything, but I think she had the core principles down pretty well.
Oh yeah,
So
yeah.
that's why I call myself a Rand fan. But I am at this stage in my life where I've started, criticizing her a bit because I think that's how you move forward.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, we criticize everyone. That's the way we get 1/1,000,000th of an inch closer to the truth by dialogue. I think David Hume was very good in his On Liberty and said, look, you want to have both sides or all seven sides heard, and that's the only way we can get to the truth. I wanted to mention one other incident of Ayn Rand. There was once a survey. Who was her publisher? Was it Putnam? I
Random House for one
Random
of
House.
them.
Random House. The Random House had a survey, named the 100 best books ever published, and two groups were surveyed. One group was the employees of Random House, and the other group was the customers of Random House. And the customers of Random House, I think Atlas Shrugged came in second to the Bible, and all of her other books were in the top 10 or maybe in the top 15. And I think that's a very nice way of doing it and a very accurate assessment of her ability. And now the survey of the employees of Random House, none of her books got into the top 100. Can you imagine that? None of her books got into the top 100. They just weren't mentioned. And I think the Random House people are the people who were voting for Kamala in the most recent election, the intelligentsia,
Absolutely.
the stupidity, the stupidness, and whatever. These highly educated people. But it's no accident because you go to a university campus and the sociology department has got 35 people in it, and they all voted Democrat. And the economics department is pretty good. 2/3 voted for Kamala and 1/3 voted for for Donald. And that's the highest percentage. But in the philosophy department, the psychology department, the history department, every other English literature department, there are virtually no free enterprise professors. So it's not a total shock that a lot of credentialed, educated people would be socialists or fascists or whatever you want to call them.
Well, William, you want to follow up?
Well, if you want to shift gears, we could talk about Walter's ideas, because I wanted to ask about privatizing cops, because you mentioned when you met Murray Rothbard, he convinced you that, why not privatize cops like you privatize the post office? And so this is where your ideas start to diverge from Rand's, because Rand believed in a limited government, with government, police departments and court systems and a military. And she justified this by saying that the government needs to protect individual rights. So that's its only function. And these are the these are the systems that will do that. So I'm curious what your justification is for privatizing cops. And I assume you'd privatize the military and the courts as well.
Absolutely, yes.
So what is the justification for taking it that step beyond Rand?
Right. Yes, that's a very good question, and I'm gonna hang up on you because you asked me a rough question.
I'm excommunicated.
You're excommunicated. I mean, obviously, I'm not serious. I'm just being silly here, but that would be a very cultish way to answer the question. Another way would be, well, you were impolite. You asked me an impolite question, and I'm not going to answer you. That's schwach in Yiddish. Not really a good way to proceed. Okay, so let me answer the question in the spirit that you ask it, which is a scholarly way to get at the truth. What I would say is this is all well and good, except for the fact that the government, which is supposedly set up in order to protect rights, starts out by violating rights. How does it violate rights? Well, how does it pay the cops? It pays the cops based on taxation and taxation of involuntary payments. And whenever anyone comes at you with a gun and demands that you pay money to them that you haven't agreed to pay, we call that theft. And so how can the government be protecting rights when at the very outset, at the very inception of government, at its very core, it's a rights violator? So I think that would be one answer. Another answer would be, well, in addition,
we agree on that. We do agree on that. I think that it is a violation of rights that they begin with taking money from you to pay for these programs.
William, we've got a lot to cover. I don't know if we're going to do the whole anarchy thing right now.
Well,
no, I just want to get at this one issue.
Okay, all right.
Okay, well, this is the anarchy issue. The other thing that government does, in addition to taxing people, is it demands a monopoly of the final of force. Where do they get that? I want to set up my own Walter Block police department, and I want to get customers, and I'll protect them. And this is seen as non-kosher. I think that's another problem with this. But look, we have many examples of the anarchy versus the limited government view. I'm clearly on the anarchy point of view, not only with the police, but also armies and courts. And if you want to get into that, I'm happy to do that. But if you want to get into other issues,
I just want one follow up. If government generated revenue voluntarily, like say through raffles or the lottery or something like that, then would you be in favor of a limited government?
It wouldn't be a limited government. It would be the private defense agencies. If it was voluntary, look, it's a contradiction. Government, the essence of government is these two things. One is taxation, which is coercion, and the other is a monopoly demand for final authority. Both of them are a violation of rights. And if they didn't do either of them, they wouldn't be a government. And then I would support them because I support anarcho-capitalism.
I see. So I think we just have a different definition of government then, because I think it still would be a government if it was a voluntary revenue system.
Well, I have to we'll have to agree to disagree.
Well, that's and I do think we're going to be talking about the anarchy issue at least tangentially by talking about Rothbard and Hoppe, and frankly how you were the victim of cancellation over being for Israel. So, a lot of objectivists don't necessarily know about Rothbard because he was kicked out and just, was Hoppe part of this living room thing that you mentioned? You mentioned at one point Rothbard admitted that Hoppe had some good points about his argumentative ethics.
No, Hoppe was too young. He was not part of the living room crowd. I think I was born in 1941, and I was one of the younger people there. I think Hans was born in 1947 or 48 or 49. He's about 6, 7 years younger than me. He came over much later. He came over when Murray moved from Brooklyn Polytech to UNLV, and Murray and Hans were colleagues at UNLV. So Hans was never part of the living room group, except in the sense that the Mises Institute was, in my view, and I don't mean this as an insult, I mean as a compliment to the Mises Institute. The Mises Institute was sort of Murray Rothbard's living room grown larger and moved to Auburn, Alabama. I think they were in Washington, D.C. for a while, but their permanent home is in Auburn, Alabama. No, so Hans came later in the history of the movement.
And so, Hoppe, you said at one point that Rothbard had the integrity to say that Hoppe's ethics was a better starting point than Rothbard's natural rights. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, yes. We all know, or at least all good libertarians know, and not every person who calls himself a libertarian would agree with this, that the essence of libertarianism is two things. One, the non-aggression principle. You cannot initiate violence against anyone else unless it's with their permission. Sadomasochism, as long as it's between consenting adults, should be legal. So should boxing be legal because, if I punch somebody in the nose, we're in the boxing ring, he can't object on the ground that this is a rights violation because he's agreed to be punched and punch above the belt. So that's one foundation of libertarianism. Another one is private property rights based homesteading. To get back to this hat, suppose I grab William's hat. Am I a rights violator? Am I a criminal? Well, it all depends upon who is the rightful owner of that hat. If he stole it from me yesterday, I'm just repossessing it. On the other hand, I never saw the hat before. It's his hat. So if I grab it, I'm a criminal. So you have to have a theory of who's the rightful owner of the hat if you want to buttress the non-aggression principle. And the libertarian view, as I see it anyway, is based on John Locke and Murray Rothbard and Hans Hoppe. The three people that I think have done the most important work on private property rights, namely the first homesteader, and then any what did Robert Nozick say? Any legitimate title transfer, buying and selling and renting and lending and gambling and stuff like that. So those are the two main elements of libertarianism, and then a lot of what libertarianism consists of is deducing from that. Namely, what's our view on unions? What's our view on the minimum wage law? What's our view on rent control? What's our view on this, that, and the other thing? So that's most of what libertarian consists of. However, there is another question, and that is what justifies the non-aggression principle and homesteading and private property rights based on homesteading? And now we have a whole bunch of different views on that. The religious people say, well, God said so. Ayn Rand said it all comes from A equals A. Don't ask how she deduces that, but that's her view.
Or from the requirements of our life.
Okay, that would be a pragmatic justification. And Murray had the view that it was sort of natural rights. And then Hans Hoppe comes along with a very different justification of the essence of libertarianism, and he called it argument from argument, or the argumentation ethics, or something like that. And I thought it was absolutely brilliant. And what he said is, look, the only way, and I'm putting words in his mouth, but this is the way I understand it. I hope I'm paraphrasing it correctly. What he said is, the only way we're going to get to the truth is by arguing with each other. Well, what does it require to have an argument? Well, you can't punch each other out. You can't shoot each other, because if you shoot each other, you don't win an argument that way. You can't win an intellectual argument. And the other thing you need in order to have an argument is you have to have a place to stand or sit. So we have to have private property rights. And I thought this was just exquisitely brilliant. The most magnificent justification of libertarianism, a sort of a META, meta libertarian thing.
Okay.
And when Hans came over from Germany with this, Hans was just this young punk kid, and I don't mean to insult him. I mean he was a baby, and Murray Rothbard was Mr. Libertarian. Now, look, I tell you that if anyone criticized Ayn Rand with a different justification of everything, she would not have taken it very happily. Murray took it. Murray was magnificent. I mean, he was the leader of the gang, leader of the group. And Hans came up with something very different than Murray's justification. And instead of Murray kicking Hans out of the movement, Murray embraced Hans and said, yes, Hans's justification is superior to my own, and I embrace it. And I think that shows something about Murray's personality, very different than Ayn Rand's personality.
And ultimately, Hoppe came to be like the main voice of the Mises Institute.
Well, that's an interesting contention.
Enough to try to deperson you from the movement.
Well, let me respond to that.
Okay.
There is this guy, Javier Milei, and Javier Milei is the president of Argentina, and Javier Milei is an anarcho-capitalist libertarian of the Rothbardian view.
Right.
And guess who he said were the leaders of the libertarian movement? Me and Hans, the two of us.
Okay.
After Murray's passing.
That may have been why you got kicked out.
No, that's one hypothesis. And Millet was not the first person to say that Murray's two most famous or most productive or most whatever followers of Murray are me and Hans. So when you say that Hans was the voice of the Mises Institute, for a time, I think you'd have to say both of us were. And then there were others, Joe Salerno, David Gordon, Tom DiLorenzo, who were also world-class scholars, if I could put that description on all of us, who were also Murray's followers. But Hans and I were singled out not only by Javier Milei, but by others who were Murray's two preeminent scholars, sort of like who were the preeminent scholars of Mises? Murray Rothbard and Israel Kirzner. People saw it that way,
right?
And who were the main followers of Mises? Hayek and Murray Rothbard. So you get this sort of phenomena, not only cancellation, but whenever you get a great man, people start saying, well, when he passes, or who are his most productive, influential students, and people start speculating about that. Well, I'm honored to say that I, along with Hans, and I revere Hans for his contribution, but I think it was sort of equal. And now you get to the question, well, he sort of stabbed me in the back over Israel. And one hypothesis is that I'm wrong on Israel and he's right on Israel, and I'm incompatible with libertarianism. That's one hypothesis. Another hypothesis is he didn't like sharing the honor of being Murray Rothbard's most prestigious follower or student, and he figured that he would get me out of that get me out of that role and take it on himself only. And that's another hypothesis.
I've seen that in other areas of the liberty movement, even within objectivism. But now Malay's somewhat for Israel as well. So this isn't a new position for you, I assume. I mean, I grew up Jewish too, and we learned in Sunday school about creation of Israel after the Holocaust. And were you for Israel when you were a socialist, or?
I didn't have any strong views on that before I came awake, or before I awoke, if I can use that word. I didn't have any strong views until I became a libertarian. And when I became a libertarian, I was pro-Israel. I never wrote about it much during the 48 war. Well, I was a little young. I was 7 years old during the 48 war, but I could have written about it in 67 or 56. I just didn't write about it. But I have written about it in 2020, and after that, I have a book co-authored with Alan Fuderman called The Classical Liberal Case for Israel, which has got a foreword written by Benjamin Netanyahu. And since then, I've been writing for the Wall Street Journal, for Hayam, for other Israeli newspapers, supporting the Israeli case on libertarian grounds. And the Mises Institute didn't much like that. It started off with Hans Hoppe, who said that I was unhinged and a maniac. I'm putting words in his mouth, but I think the paraphrase is correct. Tom DiLorenzo, who, I mean, both of these guys were buddies of mine. I mean, I'm a co-author with Hans of, I don't know, 10 articles. I'm a co-author with Tom DiLorenzo on 5 articles and 1 book. I'm a I don't know, a co-author with Lou Rockwell. I've been friends with these guys for 20, 30, 40 years. And all of a sudden, I'm a maniac, and I can no longer be associated with the Mises Institute. I used to be the senior fellow of the Mises Institute. I used to be invited to speak at pretty much every function that they put on. I'm now persona non grata, and it's a cancellation. And I don't know. I feel badly about this on a personal level because these were my friends.
Sure.
And on a professional level, I feel badly about it because I still think that the Mises Institute is the greatest think tank, public policy institute of any. My recent article on this is you should support the Mises Institute 99%. Namely, if you donate 1,000 a year, you should donate 990. Why the 1% reduction? Well, because they mistreated, not so much mistreated me, but mistreated ideas. This cancellation is not a scholarly way of proceeding. The way to proceed is to have a debate or to have a discussion, not to just say, well, look, you're out, and we're not going to talk to you, and we're not going to we're not going to consider your arguments and sayonara. And then why 99%? Because I think that they're way better than Reason, way better than Cato, way better than any of the other libertarian institutes that are out there. So I'm still a fan. Look, I'm a fan of Ayn Rand, but she has some problems. I'm a fan of the Mises Institute. They have some problems. The only problem I can think of is that they have this, what do they call it? Israel, what's the thing for Rand, for Donald Trump when they said, I forget the word. They have mishigas, craziness with regard to Israel and derangement syndrome. That's the expression.
Yeah.
There was Trump derangement syndrome, and now there's Israel derangement syndrome. And the Mises Institute is suffering from Israel derangement syndrome. And it's not, what do you call it? It's not anti-Semitism. Look, Mises, it's called the Mises Institute, but in terms of what they're really doing, it should be called the Mises Rothbard Institute.
Right.
Mises and Rothbard were both Jewish. So you can hardly say that they're anti-Semites. And they knew I was Jewish. David Gordon is Jewish. And I was friendly with them for, I don't know, 35 years or whatever it is. And my Judar is as good as anyone else's Judar. And I never sensed any anti-Semitism whatsoever. So I don't think that it's anti-Semitism. I think it's mishigas or derangement syndrome. They've just lost their minds on this one issue. But then again, everybody loses their mind on something or other. Don't ask me what I've lost my mind on. But Ayn Rand did, other people did.
I do see parallels with Branden and you because he got kicked out still loving her and Atlas Shrugged and her works on a certain level. And another thing I'm curious about that I've seen, did you find that many people maybe that just didn't want to say anything to support you openly for fear of being next to be excommunicated?
Well, there is a Festschrift in my honor. It's coming out in a month or two, according to the publisher. You know what a Festschrift is, sort of a book in honor of somebody.
Okay.
Maybe 30 or 50 people contribute essays in my honor. And there are several Mises people who have contributed to my Festschrift. So I don't think that they will be kicked out if they're in my Festschrift, and I don't think they'll be kicked out. Well, they might be kicked out if they supported me on Israel. I don't know. We'll have to see just how far the cancellation goes. But I think that they are suffering from Israel derangement syndrome, and it's a shame and a disgrace because they're violating all scholarly precepts. Because scholarly precepts is the way you get to the truth, is you argue, you discuss. Look, Hans is the creator of the argument ethics. Well, he's contradicting himself by canceling me, because on the one hand he favors argument and on the other hand he won't argue. I've challenged him to a debate. I've challenged all of those guys to a debate. They don't even respond.
Yeah, I mean, the original ideal of anarchy was to get rid of hierarchy, and kicking someone out of a group, to me, is hierarchy. I'm thinking of the original pre-libertarian anarchists.
Yes, there you're right. But the anarcho-capitalists, the libertarian anarchists, are not against hierarchy. Roderick Long, another very competent philosopher, has that view, but I don't think it's right. I don't think anarcho-capitalists are against hierarchy. I mean, the boss tells the employee what to do, and the music conductor tells the first violinist how to play. Nothing wrong with hierarchy, but there is something wrong with cancellation.
Walter, I watched your debate with David Smith, and I side with you. I mean, I'm in favor. I'm pro-Israel in this war. And I like a lot of the points you made in that debate. I think one of the things that you guys got hung up on was the killing of innocents in war. And I was wondering if you've read what Ayn Rand said about it, or listened to her in some of her Q&A sessions at the Fort Hall Forum. Because there's a book called Ayn Rand Answers, and it lists a lot of her answers that she gave. And one of them was on, she was asked, what do you think about the killing of innocent people in war? And she said, this is a major reason people should be concerned about the nature of their government. The majority in any country at war is often innocent, but if by neglect, ignorance, or helplessness, they couldn't overthrow their bad government and establish a better one, then they must pay the price for the sins of their government, as we are all paying for the sins of our government. So she was saying that innocence in war is just a collateral damage, and it has to be accepted based on the fact that those people are responsible for their government. And I think in any war, you're going to have innocents die on both sides, unless one country is just far superior.
Well, I don't know if I go along with her about the innocents are responsible for the government. Certainly, the 3-year-old child is not responsible for anything. and the 3-year-old child is among the people who unhappily are dying. I agree with her conclusion, but not with the reason that they're responsible for their government. I don't believe in positive obligations. And if you have a hermit out there somewhere in the middle of the woods and he has nothing to do with the government, it's a bad government, I don't think he's responsible for the government. However, I do believe in this collateral damage justification for the killing of innocents. And the point I made in the Dave Smith debate is, look, here I am, and I have 2 of my children, aged 1 and 3, and I've got them strapped to my front, and I'm coming at you with a knife. Where's my knife? Here's my knife. It's a pen, so don't worry. I'm not going to stab you, but I'm coming at you. And by the way, you're stronger than me. You're Israel. I'm Hamas, and I'm going to kill you. Not only you, but your children and your parents and your family. And the only way you can stop me is by shooting me. But if you shoot me, you will necessarily shoot my 1-year-old and my 3-year-old child. And the way I justify this is, well, who is responsible for the deaths of these people, given that you don't want to commit suicide and allow me to kill you, but rather you shoot me and kill my children? I'm responsible for killing those children. Hamas is responsible for the deaths of the innocent Gazans. Israel is not. Yes, Israel's bombs and bullets shot the innocents, the women and children, but the ultimate responsibility for those regrettable deaths is Hamas. And it's the same thing with Hezbollah. Hezbollah is shooting rockets into northern Israel, and Israel is supposed to sit there and take it? No, Israel is going to kick some butt, and unhappily, they embed themselves in the midst of the civilian population. They put their rocket launchers in the middle of a mosque or a school or a hospital, and then Israel has no choice but to shoot the hospital. Now, shooting a hospital or bombing a hospital sounds horrible, but they put their rocket launchers in a hospital. What is Israel supposed to do? This is a point that Dave Smith and Lou Rockwell and Tom DiLorenzo and Hans Hoppe and all these other people just don't take any cognizance of.
There's a certain level of unsportsmanlike behavior there. If you use it like a game as an analogy, where you don't play by fair rules. Armies used to meet in big fields, where they couldn't kill innocents. They just faced each other in a big field and killed each other. But nowadays, war is more urban. People are hiding in hospitals, like you say. And so they're not really playing by what civilized people would consider the fair rules of war.
Well, I think that applies to the Arabs in the Middle East, but not to Israel. I think Israel plays fair. Israel doesn't start any wars. Israel finishes the wars, and I hope they'll finish this one good. And by that I mean conquer those guys and not have any pause or reflection or ceasefire or anything like that until those hostages are released, and until Hamas and Hezbollah and the Revolutionary Guard of Iran are dealt with very severely.
What I find interesting about your treatment is that the Mises Caucus kind of took over the Libertarian Party and then even went against their party when Chase was their nominee to back Trump, who is kind of known as a big supporter of Israel. And so, but they're not getting as mad at him about his support of Israel. It's not a deal breaker for them.
Yeah, well, Chase Oliver, the standard bearer of the Libertarian Party, is pro-Hamas, or at least he's not pro-Israel. And I think that's a disgrace, but what the heck? Look, we disagree. We can agree to disagree. William and I just agreed to disagree about privatizing the cops. William and I are still friendly. We're not going to, cancel each other. We're both libertarians. We don't say, well, if you disagree with me, you're not really a libertarian. This is the view of the Mises Institute, that somehow, okay, I'm good on rent control and the minimum wage, but when it comes to important issues, complicated issues, I'm just a non-libertarian. This is just silly.
Is there a level of pacifism, that's just outrageous here? Is that the issue? Because maybe they're not anti-Semites, but maybe they're just irrational pacifists.
They don't understand self-defense.
That's an interesting theory. I never thought of that. I think I don't think they want Israel to commit suicide, although I'm not sure about that. But their views are in effect compatible with the suicide of Israel, the breakup of Israel. Having a Palestine, what do they call it, a Palestinian state. The Palestinians have been offered a state in the Oslo Accords, and they've been offered it many, many times. And look, they had a state. The Israelis left Gaza in 2005, and it was an Arab state. They
Right,
were
they
the
voted in
sovereign.
Hamas.
I'm sorry.
They voted in Hamas.
They voted it. Well, Hamas conquered the PA, the Palestinian Authority, in
Right.
'07. But the point is that they had a state, and what did they do with the state? They were given massive amounts of money. They were given metal. They were given concrete. Did they build hotels? No. Did they build desalination plants? No. Did they build tunnels? Yes, tunnels out of which to erupt and start killing Jews. And they built munitions. What Israel really wanted for Gaza was to make it the Hong Kong of the Middle East by having free enterprise. Now, look, Israel started out as a socialist state, but happily with Likud and Netanyahu, they're very free enterprise. They're very productive. They wanted Gaza to be the Hong Kong of the Middle East. They had a state. Look at what they did with the state. They just used it to attack Israel. By the way, I promised you guys 1 hour, and we've got 2 more minutes. So maybe one last question or one last comment?
Yeah, I'm just curious if you have any kind of anecdote about Rand or anyone else in the inner circle you haven't shared yet.
Yes, I do. I once introduced her to my mother and my sister. And the anecdote that I had, she was just very polite, that she hardly knew me, but I was one of many, many accolades of hers. The thing that most strikes me about her personally is her eyes. When you were in the room with her, you knew that before she spoke, even if you didn't know who she was, you knew you were in a room with a person of substance. I mean, her eyes glinted. She was just a magnificent woman. My only regret with her is that I didn't try to hug her. I wish I had hugged her. I would have been a better person for having hugged her. I didn't have the temerity to do it, but I could have asked. I could have said, "Can I please have a hug?" And that's one of my great regrets. I am delighted and honored that I was a little part of her life, and she was a big part of mine.
That's wonderful. William, any final question?
No, I just want to thank you for coming on the program and answering my questions. It was a delight, and I hope to speak to you some other time.
Grab that punch out. Here, and send me the URL for this.
Yes, I absolutely will. Thank you so much for doing the show. Again, this is Scott Schiff along with William Swig, and we will see you next time. Take care.
Thanks for having me. Take care. Bye.